Here's a question, and I want you to sit with it for a second before you answer, because the answer is not what you think it is. Name the moment in the Second World War when the most powerful military commander in the Western world put his own name, his own career, and his own reputation on the line in writing for a disaster that had not happened yet. Not a victory speech, not a press release, a confession drafted in advance, accepting total blame for a defeat that might be coming in a matter of hours. You probably can't name it. Most people can't. And that is strange, because the man who wrote it would go on to become President of the United States. And the document itself sits today in a climate-controlled vault in Abilene, Kansas, one of the most studied pieces of paper in American military history. It is a note, 66 words long, written in pencil, on a single sheet of paper a little over 4 inches wide. He folded it, put it in his wallet, and then forgot it was there for more than a month. And when he finally found it again, he tried to throw it away. That note is the most honest thing any senior American commander put on paper during the entire war. And on this channel, we spend most of our time on the opposite. We spend our time on the men who stole credit, who dodged blame, who built reputations out of other men's work. So today, I want to do something different. I want to show you what the opposite looked like. I want to show you the note that General Dwight Eisenhower wrote before D-Day, the note he prayed no one would ever have to read. And I want to ask the harder question underneath it. Did he actually live up to it? Because the note is easy to admire, the man is harder to judge, and by the time we are done, I think you will see both more clearly. The legend and the reality. Let me set the scene, because the scene is everything here. It is the first week of June, 1944. On the southern coast of England, near Portsmouth, there is a country house called Southwick House. It is the forward command post for the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted in human history. The operation has a name overlord and a man in sole command of it. That man is 53 years old. He smokes, by the contemporaneous account of his own naval aide, as many as 80 Camel cigarettes a day. He drinks 15 to 20 cups of coffee daily. He has high blood pressure, headaches, a ringing in one ear, and he is not sleeping. His aide, Commander Harry Butcher, wrote in his diary in the middle of May, and I am quoting the entry as Rick Atkinson reproduces it in The Guns at Last Light, that Ike looked worn and tired, that the strain was telling on him, that he looked older then than at any time Butcher had known him. That is not a legend. That is a man's personal aide writing it down at the time in private. And here is the weight that man was carrying. Roughly 156,000 soldiers were about to be thrown across the English Channel onto 5 beaches in occupied France. The official British history puts the precise figure at 156,115 men landed on the 6th of June. Behind them, an invasion fleet of nearly 7,000 vessels. The number historians cite is 6,939 ships, crewed by something close to 196,000 sailors from 8 different navies. Overhead, more than 11,000 Allied aircraft, 2,395 aircraft, and 867 gliders just for the airborne drops. One man had to decide whether all of that went forward or didn't, and he had to decide it largely alone. And here is the thing that I think most people miss about Dwight Eisenhower. The thing that makes the burden even heavier when you understand it. He had never done anything like this, not because he was incompetent, because the Army had simply never given him the chance. Most of you know the broad outline, but let me put the specifics in front of you, because the specifics are startling. Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1915. In the famous class they later called the class the Stars fell on, because so many of its members became generals. He finished, by the way, ranked 61st out of 164. Solidly middle of the pack. And then, when the United States entered the First World War, the war that made the reputations of the men of his generation, Eisenhower did not get to fight in it. He spent the First World War in the United States, training tank crews at a camp in Pennsylvania, desperate to get overseas, and was repeatedly told no. The armistice was signed days before he was finally scheduled to ship out. He missed the entire war. He never heard a shot fired in anger. Sit with that for a moment. The man who would command the largest invasion in history had, as of 1941, never personally led troops in combat. Not a platoon, not a company. By the time he was tapped for high command, he had never held an active field command above the level of a brigade. He had spent the interwar years as a staff officer, a planner, a man who wrote and organized and thought, including several uncomfortable years working directly under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, an experience that taught him, I suspect, a great deal about exactly the kind of commander he did not want to be. So why him? Why did the Army reach past hundreds of more senior, more battle-tested officers and hand the most important command of the war to a man who had never led men in battle? The answer is one man, George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. In 1942, Marshall selected Eisenhower to command American forces in Europe over more than 360 officers who outranked him. The figure usually cited is 366. Marshall did not pick him for his combat record because he did not have one. Marshall picked him for his mind, his temperament, his ability to organize enormous undertakings, and above all, his ability to make proud, prickly competing national allies actually work together. And that is the real job description of the Supreme Commander, and it is the thing that critics who sniffed at his lack of combat experience never fully understood. Eisenhower's task was not to take a hill, it was to hold a coalition together. President Roosevelt is supposed to have put it bluntly that Eisenhower was the best politician among the military men. That was not an insult. The thing that was about to be attempted required a man who could keep an American, a Briton, and a Canadian pulling on the same rope without strangling each other. And history is littered with coalitions that fell apart for want of exactly that. Look at the cast he had to manage. Under him as ground commander for the invasion was Bernard Montgomery, the British field marshal, a brilliant and almost impossibly difficult man whom much of the American command could not stand. His naval commander was Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the man who had pulled the Army off the beaches at Dunkirk 4 years earlier. His air commander was Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, whom you will hear from again shortly and not happily. His deputy was another British Air Marshal, Arthur Tedder. His senior American field commander was Omar Bradley, a name this channel knows well. And his chief of staff was Walter Bedell Smith, a famously sharp-tongued American who acted as Eisenhower's hatchet man so that Eisenhower himself could stay above the fray. Bedell Smith left us one line about that first week of June that I think is the truest description of what his boss was facing. He said he had never before realized the loneliness and isolation of a commander. At the moment a momentous decision has to be taken, with the full knowledge that failure or success rests on his judgment alone. His judgment alone. Hold onto that phrase, because in a few minutes you're going to see Eisenhower write almost exactly those words in his own hand. So that is the man. Inexperienced in combat, chosen for his temperament, surrounded by allies who outranked him in fame and frequently in ego, and sitting alone at the top of a decision that could lose the war in an afternoon. Now you understand the stakes. To understand the note, you have to understand the decision. And to understand the decision, you have to understand that the enemy that nearly beat Dwight Eisenhower in the first week of June was not the German army. It was the weather. The invasion could not happen on just any day. It needed a very specific and very rare set of natural conditions. It needed a low tide at dawn so the landing craft could see and avoid the obstacles that Field Marshal Rommel had planted across the beaches. It needed a late rising full moon, or close to it, so the paratroopers and glider troops dropping in darkness the night before would have light to land by. Those two conditions, the right tide and the right moon, lined up together on only 3 days that month, the 5th of June, the 6th, and the 7th. Missed that window, and the next one was roughly 2 weeks away. The original date was the 5th, and the weather turned against him. The man whose job it was to read that weather was a Royal Air Force officer, Group Captain James Stagg. Stagg sat at the top of a forecasting operation that was, frankly, a mess of disagreement. He was trying to reconcile 3 different forecasting teams who routinely contradicted each other. One team in the British Met Office, one American team, one Royal Navy team. They argued. The science of forecasting in 1944 was nothing like what we have now. There were no satellites. Stagg was working off weather reports radioed in from ships and from remote stations out in the Atlantic, including, famously, observations relayed from a post office at Blacksod Point on the west coast of Ireland. On the evening of the 3rd of June and into the 4th, Stagg told Eisenhower the weather for the 5th would be bad. Heavy seas, low cloud, high winds, the kind of conditions that would scatter the airborne drops and swamp the landing craft. Eisenhower made the first hard call. He postponed 24 hours. I want you to understand how much courage that first decision took, because it is overshadowed by the famous one that came after it, and it shouldn't be. Postponing was not the safe choice. There was no safe choice. That is the whole nature of the trap Eisenhower was in. If he went on the 5th, and Stagg was right about the weather, he could lose the invasion to the sea before a single German fired a shot. But if he postponed, and the weather on the 5th turned out fine after all, He would have thrown away one of his only 3 usable days for nothing and burned a day of secrecy he could not get back. Now think about what a postponement actually meant in physical terms. This was not a matter of sending an email and rescheduling a meeting. Some of those ships had already sailed. Convoys were already at sea in heavy weather, men packed into the steel hulls of landing craft, seasick, soaked, briefed, wound up to the absolute pitch of readiness for the worst day of their lives. Postponing meant turning some of those convoys around and bringing them back, refueling them and holding tens of thousands of keyed-up men in an agonizing limbo for another full day, all while praying that the single greatest secret of the war, the thing the entire German command was straining to discover, did not leak in the extra time. And there was a deeper fear underneath it. Eisenhower knew that if he had to postpone past the 7th of June, he would lose the tide and moon window entirely and be forced to wait around 2 weeks for the next one. And a 2-week delay was close to a nightmare scenario. It would mean unloading all those men from all those ships, men who had already been sealed away from the outside world for security, and the longer they sat, the more certain it became that word would get out, and the Germans would know precisely what was coming and precisely where. Eisenhower said something during those deliberations on the 4th that is well attested, and that I think captures the whole agony of it. He said the question was just how long you could keep an operation like this hanging on the end of a limb and let it hang there. That is the voice of a man being slowly crushed between 2 unacceptable choices. And then, on the evening of the 4th of June, Stagg came back into the room with something different. He had found a break. A narrow window of improved weather, maybe 36 hours of it, opening up and moving across the channel. Not good weather, just less terrible weather. Enough, maybe, to go. This was the moment. Late on the 4th, into the early hours of the 5th, Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders in the library at Southwick House. Rain was lashing the windows. He went around the room. His ground commander, Bernard Montgomery, said, "Go." His naval commander, Admiral Ramsey, was ready. His air commander, Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, was worried about the cloud cover for air support, but the consensus was there. And then Eisenhower sat in silence for a time, and then he gave the order. Now, here I have to stop and be straight with you, because this is exactly the kind of detail this audience cares about, and exactly the kind of detail that most documentaries get lazy about. You have probably heard that Eisenhower turned to the room and said, "Okay, let's go." You have heard it because Stephen Ambrose used that phrasing in Ambrose's book sold by the millions. Here is the problem. We do not actually know what Eisenhower said. We do not have a reliable record of the exact words. I'm going to lean on the work of Tim Rives here, the deputy director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, who wrote a careful study of this exact question for the National Archives journal Prologue, published in the spring of 2014. Rives went looking for the original quote and found at least 5 different versions. Eisenhower's own chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, wrote that Ike said, "Well, we'll go." Montgomery's chief of staff remembered it as, "We will sail tomorrow." The intelligence chief, Kenneth Strong, remembered, "Okay, boys, we will go." Admiral Ramsey, through a journalist, was quoted as something closer to, "Okay, let her rip." And here's the kicker. Eisenhower himself, drafting a single magazine article years later, wrote several different versions of his own famous line, including, "We will attack tomorrow." The man who said it could not remember exactly what he said. So when a documentary tells you, with total confidence, the precise 3 words Eisenhower used at that moment, you are being told a story, not a fact. I'm telling you the truth instead, which is that he gave the order, the words are lost, and the decision was made. The invasion was on for the 6th of June, and then the most powerful commander in the West had nothing left to do but wait. He had given the order. He could not call it back. The machine was moving, and in that gap, that terrible empty space between the decision and the result, he did 2 things that tell you who he was. If you are getting something out of this, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to that gap and what Eisenhower did inside it. The first thing he did was get in a car and drive to an airfield. On the evening of the 5th of June, Eisenhower went to Greenham Common Airfield near Newbury to see off the men of the 101st Airborne Division. I want you to understand why that choice cuts as deep as it does. The airborne drop was the single piece of the plan that Eisenhower had been told, in plain language, would be a massacre. His own air commander, Lee Mallory, had come to him at the end of May and warned of the futile slaughter of the 2 American airborne divisions. In Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower's own memoir, He records the estimate he was given as something like 70% losses among the glider troops, and at least 50% among the paratroopers. Lee Mallory wanted the airborne operation called off. Eisenhower thought about it, went away alone, and concluded that without the airborne troops securing the flank behind Utah Beach, the whole landing there might fail, and if that failed, the entire invasion might unravel. He let the order stand. He decided by himself to accept what he had been told could be a 70% casualty rate among those young men, and then he drove out to look them in the face. There's a photograph of this. You have almost certainly seen it. Eisenhower, in his uniform, hands together talking to a cluster of paratroopers with blackened faces and bulging equipment. The young officer he is looking at in that picture has a placard around his neck with the number 23 on it, his aircraft number. His name was First Lieutenant Wallace Strobel of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, and the 6th of June was, of all things, his 22nd birthday. Strobel remembered later that Eisenhower asked him where he was from, and when Strobel said Michigan, Eisenhower said something about the great fishing there. Think about that. He's making small talk about fishing with a 22-year-old whom he has just personally condemned to a mission he was warned might kill 7 men in 10. In Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower wrote that he found the men in fine fettle and that many of them joshingly told him he had no cause to worry because the 101st was on the job. The men were reassuring the Supreme Commander, not the other way around. When the planes took off, near midnight, the witnesses who were there, including his driver and several others, said there were tears in his eyes. The historian Carlo d'Este, in his biography, Eisenhower, A Soldier's Life, writes that his driver thought him the loneliest man in the world at that moment. He stood and watched the aircraft carrying those men disappear into the dark, and then he turned and said, quietly, to no one in particular, that it was very hard to look a soldier in the eye and know you might be sending him to his death. Now I will be honest about that last line too, because the rule on this channel is that I do not hand you memory as if it were gospel. The most quoted versions of Eisenhower's private words that night come through his driver, Kay Summersby, in memoirs written long afterward, and serious historians treat Summersby's recollections with caution. So take the exact wording as a recollection, attributed to her, not as a transcript. But the tears at the airfield, those are reported by multiple witnesses, including an NBC correspondent who was present. The grief was real, even if the precise sentence is uncertain. That was the first thing he did in the gap. He went and faced the men he might be killing. The second thing he did was sit down with a pencil and accept the blame for all of it in advance. This is the note. And now we get to the heart of it. At some point around the 5th of June, Eisenhower took a single sheet of paper, a little over 4 inches by 7, and he wrote out, by hand, in pencil, a short statement to be released to the world in the event that the invasion failed. He wrote it before he knew the outcome. He wrote it as insurance against catastrophe. And what he chose to put in it is the whole reason we are here today. I am going to give you the words, because the words matter and because this audience deserves the actual text and not my paraphrase of it. Here is what Dwight Eisenhower wrote. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Mine alone. And in the original, he drew a long, hard line underneath those 2 words. Mine alone, underlined, in pencil, by a man who at that moment had no idea whether, by the next nightfall, he would be the architect of the greatest victory of the war or the man who drowned an army in the Channel. I want to take that note apart, line by line, because every single phrase in it is a deliberate choice, and the choices are what reveal the man. Look at the first line again. Our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. He is not hedging. He is not blaming the weather, which would have been the easiest thing in the world because the weather very nearly did beat him. He is not blaming faulty intelligence. He is stating the failure flatly and taking the decision to withdraw onto himself. I have withdrawn the troops. The first person, immediately. Then look at this line. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. Here is where I want to point out something that almost no general account of this note mentions, and it is the single most revealing thing about the whole document. That sentence did not start that way. Tim Reeves, the same archivist I cited earlier, examined the original and documented that Eisenhower edited the note in several places with a heavy pencil. And the most important edit is this one. He began that second sentence by writing, "This particular operation." Then he crossed it out, and he replaced it with "my decision to attack." Stop and feel the difference between those two phrasings. This particular operation was based upon the best information available. That is a sentence about a plan. It is institutional. It is the kind of language a man uses when he is putting a little distance between himself and the failure. The operation failed. Things didn't work out. My decision to attack was based upon the best information available. That is a sentence about a man. It is personal. It puts Eisenhower himself, his own judgment, his own choice, at the dead center of the disaster. He looked at the version that protected him slightly, and he crossed it out, and he chose the version that exposed him completely. In the worst hour, with the highest possible stakes, given a free choice between a phrasing that shared the blame with an impersonal plan and a phrasing that nailed it to his own chest, he reached for the pencil and chose to take it himself. I think that single edit, that crossing out of 3 words, tells you more about command character than 100 medals. In my view, it is the most important pencil stroke any American commander made in the entire European war. And notice what he did not do in that same sentence, because the omissions are as revealing as the words. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. He could so easily have leaned on that phrase, the best information available, to start building his defense. He could have written that the intelligence was incomplete, that the forecasters had given him a narrow read, that he had been forced to act on imperfect knowledge, all of which was completely true, and all of which would have softened the blame. The weather forecasting alone, as we have seen, was a genuine gamble on contested data. A lesser man would have laid the groundwork right there for the inquiry that follows every military disaster, the inquiry where everyone explains why it wasn't really their fault. Eisenhower mentions the information once, in passing, and then immediately turns the sentence back onto his own decision. He's not building a defense. He's closing off his own escape routes one by one. Now look at the 3rd line. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. In the actual handwriting, he capitalized the word bravery. He is in the middle of writing his own potential disgrace, and he stops to give full, unqualified credit to everyone underneath him. The soldiers, the airmen, the sailors. They did everything right, he is saying. If this failed, it was not their failure. It was mine. And then the close. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Mine alone. Now, I have read a great many command communications from the Second World War for this channel, and I want to tell you how rare that sentence is, because the rarity is the entire point. Remember what Eisenhower's own chief of staff, Bedell Smith, said about the loneliness of command, that failure or success rests on the commander's judgment alone. Eisenhower took that abstract burden, the thing every senior officer talks about, and he made it concrete and permanent and signed it. Most commanders feel the weight of sole responsibility in private, and then, when it comes time to put pen to paper for the record, instinctively spread it around. Eisenhower did the reverse. He felt the weight and then made absolutely certain that the written record would carry it back to him and to no one else. Think about everything we have covered on this channel. Think about the men who built careers out of communiques that mentioned themselves and erased the men who actually fought. Tim Rives makes exactly this contrast in his work, and I think it is the right one. Douglas MacArthur's "I shall return" was not a soldier's promise. It was a slogan, carefully worded for the cameras, after the Office of War Information had actually suggested the more modest "we shall return," and MacArthur insisted on the "I." The credit always flowed up to him. The blame, when there was blame, always seemed to land on someone else, and the contrast goes deeper than one phrase. Think about how MacArthur's communiques from the Pacific were written. They routinely spoke of a single commander, named in the 3rd person, as though he were personally storming the beaches, while the men who actually planned and fought those campaigns, men this channel has spent entire episodes trying to give their names back to, went unmentioned. The whole machinery of that headquarters was built to gather credit upward and push blame downward and outward. We have documented it. You have watched the episodes. Now hold that next to a single sheet of pencil writing in which the most powerful Allied commander in Europe credits the troops, the air, and the Navy by name, and assigns the blame to exactly one person, himself. Compare those 2 letters directly. "I shall return" and "mine alone." One man writing himself into the headline of a victory he had not yet won. Another man writing himself into the obituary of a defeat that had not yet happened. That contrast, those 2 sentences laid side by side, that is the whole channel in a nutshell. That is the difference between command as performance and command as responsibility. Because here's the pattern, and this is the part I most want you to take away from this episode. The American Army in the Second World War, the institution this whole channel exists to examine, contained both kinds of men at the same time, all the way up. It produced the image builders, the men who understood that in a modern war fought partly in the newspapers, a well-managed reputation could outrun an actual record. And it produced, at the very top of the European command, a man who understood the opposite, that command is not about what you collect when things go right, but about what you absorb when things go wrong. And if this sounds familiar, if you have spent 30 years inside any large organization and watched the person who quietly did the work get passed over, while the person who carefully managed their own image climbed the ladder, you are not imagining it. It was true in 1944, and it is true now. The system does not automatically reward the man who takes responsibility. Very often it rewards the man who is best at avoiding it. Eisenhower wrote a note designed to do the exact opposite of avoiding it, and he wrote it at the one moment in his life when avoiding it would have been most tempting and most understandable. So that is the legend, and it is a true legend, which is rarer than you would think. But this channel does not do legends without testing them. So now comes the harder part. Now we put the man on trial against the standard of his own note. Because it is one thing to write mine alone on a piece of paper in private, knowing you will tear it up if you win. It is another thing to actually live that way, year after year, when the cameras are on and the careers are at stake. So let me ask it directly. Did Dwight Eisenhower actually practice the accountability he preached in that note? Or was the note a beautiful exception? I'm going to give you the evidence on both sides, fairly, because that is what this audience has earned. And then I will give you my verdict. Let me start with the case for the defense, because it is strong. Exhibit 1. 16 months before D-Day, in February of 1943, the American Army got its teeth kicked in at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. It was the first major clash between American and German ground forces in the war, and the Americans were humiliated. More than 6,000 American casualties in a matter of days. Green troops broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. It was, by any honest measure, a disaster, and it badly shook the confidence of the British Allies in whether the Americans could fight at all. The Corps commander on the ground was Lloyd Fredendall, and Fredendall is a man this channel could do an entire episode on, because he is almost a caricature of everything that goes wrong when the system promotes the wrong person. While his men were being overrun, Fredendall was dozens of miles behind the front, in an elaborate underground command bunker that his engineers had spent weeks blasting into a hillside, a bunker he rarely left. He gave orders to units he had never seen, over terrain he had never walked, in a personal slang code so garbled that his own subordinates struggled to understand what he wanted. Now, Eisenhower was the theater commander. Kasserine happened on his watch, under a command structure he had approved, with a corps commander he had left in place, and here is what he did. Yes, he relieved Fredendall, and he replaced him with George Patton, which tells you he understood the problem. But he did not stop at finding a man to blame. Eisenhower looked hard at his own role in the defeat. He acknowledged that the command arrangements he had set up, the dispersal of American units under foreign command, the muddled lines of authority, had contributed to the disaster. He reformed how he ran the theater. In other words, faced with a real failure under his command, his instinct was not only to find the responsible subordinate, but to ask what he himself had gotten wrong. That is the same instinct as the note, 16 months early, with real blood already spilled. Exhibit 2, and this one is almost too perfect. On the 7th of June, the day after D-Day, Eisenhower went out to see the beaches from the sea. The ship carrying him ran aground because Eisenhower had ordered it to go in closer to the shore than was safe, so he could get a better look. The grounding was, by the rules, the skipper's responsibility, the kind of thing that ends a naval career. Eisenhower sat down and wrote to the British Sea Lord and took responsibility for it himself, explaining that the grounding happened because of his own order, and asking specifically that the ship's captain not be punished for it. That is a tiny incident. Nobody died. And that is exactly why it is such good evidence. There was no pressure on him to do that. He did it because that is how the man operated when no one was watching. The same instinct as the note, in miniature. Exhibit 3 is the airborne decision we already discussed. When Lee Mallory predicted catastrophe for the paratroopers and wanted the drop canceled, Eisenhower did not pass that decision up to anyone. He took it, alone, and he carried the weight of it personally. And the record shows he was prepared to own the result if those young men had died at the rate he was warned they might. As it happened, the airborne casualties came in far below Lee Mallory's grim prediction, and Lee Mallory, to his credit, wrote Eisenhower a letter afterward apologizing for having added to his burden with the gloomy forecast. But the point stands. Eisenhower took that risk onto his own shoulders and did not flinch from it. He had even put the philosophy into words long before D-Day. Back in September of 1943, he told Lord Mountbatten that a commander has to make his decision in a clean-cut fashion, on his own responsibility, and take the full blame for anything that goes wrong, whether or not it actually resulted from his own mistake, whether or not it was his fault. That is the doctrine the note came from. It was not a one-time performance. It was a stated belief, on the record, months earlier. So that is the case for the defense, and it is a serious case. By the standard of nearly every other senior commander we cover, Eisenhower's record on personal accountability is genuinely admirable, and the note is consistent with how he actually behaved. But I told you we would put him on trial, and a trial has a prosecution. So let me give you the other side, fairly, because the same audience that wants me to give him credit also wants me to be honest about his flaws. And he had them. The most thorough critic of Eisenhower, oddly enough, is also one of his most respected biographers, Carlo d'Este in Eisenhower, A Soldier's Life. d'Este admires the man, but he does not whitewash him. And d'Este makes the case that Eisenhower grossly played favorites, that he kept officers he liked in major positions long after they had proven they could not do the job, and that this loyalty to his circle was a real institutional weakness. Accountability cuts both ways. If you take the blame when things go wrong, you also have to hold the right people responsible when they fail. And the charge against Eisenhower is that with certain favored subordinates, he did not. Then there is the strategy. From late 1944 onward, Eisenhower committed to what was called the broad front approach, advancing all along the line rather than concentrating force for a single sharp thrust into Germany. Montgomery hated it. Patton hated it. And a number of serious historians, including David Colley in The Folly of Generals, argue that the broad front lengthened the war and cost lives that a bolder, more concentrated strategy might have saved. You can disagree with that critique, and many do, but it is a real one made by serious people, and the man who wrote mine alone owns those decisions too. There is the failure to close the Falaise Gap quickly in August of 1944, which let a large part of a trapped German army escape to fight again. Command responsibility for that delay is shared, but it sat in Eisenhower's theater, and there is the case that on this channel hits hardest of all because it involves a man we have covered and admired. In November of 1944, General Jacob Devers and his 6th Army Group reached the Rhine near Strasbourg, and Devers wanted to cross it, to throw a bridgehead onto the German side of the river months ahead of schedule. Eisenhower said no. He ordered Devers to turn north instead. And critics, David Colley prominent among them, argue that Eisenhower's personal coolness toward Devers, a general he never warmed to, played a part in that decision, and that a Rhine crossing in November of 1944 might have shortened the war and might even have prevented the Battle of the Bulge that erupted a month later. Devers himself believed it. So here is the uncomfortable truth I have to put in front of you. The same man who wrote the most accountable note of the war is also, by the channel's own standards, guilty of exactly the kind of decision we criticize in others. A decision where personal feeling toward a subordinate may have shaped a command call that cost time and lives. Both things are true. And I am not going to pretend they aren't, because that is the deal I have with you. And this is the place to step back and ask the bigger question that historians have argued over for 80 years. Was Dwight Eisenhower actually a great commander? Or was he, as some of his sharper critics have always insisted, essentially a gifted political manager in a soldier's uniform? A chairman of the board who happened to wear 4 stars? It is a fair question, and the answer, I think, is genuinely more complicated than either camp wants it to be. The critics have real ammunition. From the British military historian Chester Wilmot in the early post-war years, through writers like Max Hastings in our own time, the charge has been consistent. They argue that Eisenhower was no battlefield strategist, that he was cautious to a fault, that he stayed too far in the rear, that he had a weakness for compromise that produced muddy half measures like the broad front, and that his real gift was diplomacy rather than generalship. There is something to that. The man had, as we discussed, never commanded troops in combat, and it occasionally showed in his handling of fast-moving operational decisions. But the defenders, and they include heavyweight historians, answer that this misunderstands the job entirely. Rick Atkinson, in The Guns at Last Light, presents Eisenhower as a work in progress, a man who was growing into an almost impossible role in real time, and ultimately as the right man for a job that very few human beings could have done at all. Carlo d'Este, even with all his criticisms, writes flatly that no commander in military history faced a more daunting task than the one Eisenhower faced in 1944. And their point is this: the Supreme Commander's true assignment was never to out General Rommel on a map. It was to weld together a fractious, proud multinational coalition and keep it welded together through 2 years of strain that would have shattered a lesser temperament. By that measure, the measure that actually mattered, he succeeded where almost anyone else would have failed. My own view sits between them, and I think it is the honest place to sit. Eisenhower was a flawed strategist and an extraordinary commander, and those two statements only sound contradictory if you believe command is mostly about strategy. It isn't. At the level Eisenhower operated, command was about judgment, temperament, the ability to hold authority without abusing it, and the willingness to own the consequences of decisions no one else could be made to share. And on that last quality, the one the note is made of, he was as good as anyone the American Army ever produced. So let me weigh it and give you my verdict, because that is what a trial is for. Here's what I think. I think Dwight Eisenhower was, on the specific question of personal accountability, the real article, not a saint, not a flawless commander. His strategy is genuinely debatable. His treatment of favorites was a real flaw, and the Devers decision is a stain that this channel will never paper over. But on the narrow, crucial question of whether he was willing to take the blame onto himself rather than spread it to the men below him, the evidence says yes, consistently, across years, in public and in private, when it cost him nothing and when it could have cost him everything. The note was not an exception. It was the purest expression of something that ran all the way through him. And I think the reason that matters, the reason it is worth 40 minutes of your time, is the contrast. We spend most of our episodes on the other kind of man, the image builder, the credit thief, the general whose communiques mention himself and erase the men who bled. And it would be easy, watching this channel, to conclude that the whole American command system in the Second World War was rotten with that kind of careerism. It wasn't. The system produced both kinds. It produced the men who wrote themselves into the headlines, and it produced, at the very top, a man who wrote himself into an obituary he hoped no one would read. That is the part the easy version of history misses. The system did not only fail. At its highest level, in its most important decision, it was carried by a man who understood that command means the buck does not move. It stops with you, mine alone. Now let me tell you what happened to the note, because the ending is almost too good to be true, and it is true. Eisenhower did not need it. The invasion succeeded. Bloody, yes. By the research of the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, Allied casualties on the 6th of June were at least 10,000, with 4,414 confirmed dead, of whom 2,501 were Americans. None of the day's objectives, the towns of Caen, Bayeux, Carentan, was fully taken on the first day. But the beachhead held. The army was not thrown back into the sea. The note describing a withdrawal that never happened went into Eisenhower's wallet, folded up, and he forgot about it entirely. It is worth pausing on how close the other version came. Remember that the next available window after the 7th of June was roughly 2 weeks later, around the 19th. And what happened around the 19th of June, 1944? The worst storm to hit the Normandy coast in 40 years. This is not a small detail, and I do not want you to skim past it, because it is the single fact that turns Eisenhower's weather gamble from a coin flip into something close to Providence. A gale blew in from the northeast and battered the invasion coast for 3 solid days. It churned the channel into exactly the kind of sea that would have torn a landing fleet apart, and its most famous victim shows you the scale of it. The Allies had towed 2 enormous artificial harbors across the channel in pieces, engineering marvels called mulberries, one for the British beaches, and one for the Americans, off Omaha. The storm of the 19th wrecked the American mulberry, destroying the great majority of the massive concrete caissons that formed its breakwater, putting it out of action permanently. These were harbors built to survive the channel, and the storm broke one of them in 3 days. Now run the counterfactual. If Eisenhower had lost his nerve in that library on the night of the 4th of June, if he had looked at Stagg's narrow, uncertain little window and decided it was too risky and postponed to the next tide and moon window, his invasion fleet would have sailed around the 19th directly into the teeth of the worst storm Normandy had seen in 4 decades. The landing craft would have foundered. The airborne drops would have been scattered to nothing. The note describing a failed landing and a withdrawal might well have become the truest and most necessary thing Dwight Eisenhower ever wrote. He did not know any of that on the night of the 4th. He could not have known it. He simply made the harder call on the worse information and was proven, by the weather 2 weeks later, to have been catastrophically right to go when he did. He later sent Stagg a short note thanking the gods of war that they went when they did. the gods of war, and one exhausted man who chose to trust a thin forecast over his own fear. He went when he did, and he won. And the note sat folded in his wallet for 35 days. Now let me tell you how it survived, because it very nearly did not, and the way it survived is the final piece of the portrait. On the 11th of July, 1944, more than a month after D-Day, by which point the beachhead was secure and the army was fighting its way inland through the hedgerows, Eisenhower was going through his things and came across the folded paper again. He unfolded it and read it, this thing he had written in the worst hour of his life, the confession of a defeat that had never come. And he decided it had served its purpose, the danger was past, and he was simply going to get rid of it. And here we owe a debt to one man, his naval aide, Harry Butcher. The same Harry Butcher whose diary back in May told us how worn and old Eisenhower had looked. Butcher was in the room, and Butcher understood something that Eisenhower in that moment apparently did not. He understood that this scrap of pencil writing was not trash. He understood that it was one of the most revealing documents of the entire war, a window into the character of the man at the top that nothing else could provide. So Butcher asked if he could keep it, and Eisenhower, by Butcher's own account, gave in, but reluctantly. He did not see what the fuss was about. Think about what that means. The single best piece of physical evidence we have for the moral character of the man who commanded the liberation of Western Europe survives today only because an aide had the presence of mind to save what the commander himself was ready to throw in the bin. Eisenhower did not think his own act of integrity was a historic document. He did not think it was anything at all. He thought it was simply what a commander was supposed to do, so ordinary and so obvious that once the crisis had passed, there was no reason to keep the evidence of it. The humility is almost the most impressive part. He performed the single most accountable act of the war and then tried to throw away the proof. There is one more small detail, and I have saved it for the end, because I think it is the most human thing in the entire story. Look at the date on the note. Eisenhower dated it July 5th, but he wrote it in June before the invasion. June 5th. He wrote July instead of June. The Eisenhower Presidential Library notes this plainly. The most famous note he ever wrote, the document scholars have pored over for 80 years, is misdated by a full month. When somebody asked him about it decades later in 1966, he could only conclude it must have been a careless error. A careless error. This is a man with one of the most organized minds in the United States Army. A man who could hold the logistics of a 156,000-man invasion in his head. And he wrote the wrong month on the most important note of his life. I do not think that is sloppiness. I think that is the single clearest window we have into what was actually happening inside Dwight Eisenhower in those hours. A man so consumed by the weight of what he was about to do, so worn down by 80 cigarettes a day and no sleep, and the knowledge that he was personally sending tens of thousands of men toward beaches and drop zones, some of them would never leave, that he could not reliably remember what month it was. The legend is the steady hand and the underlined mine alone. The reality, hiding in plain sight in that wrong date, is a frightened, exhausted 53-year-old human being doing the hardest thing anyone in that war was asked to do, and doing it anyway. That is the part I want you to remember, not the marble statue, the man with the pencil, getting the date wrong, and getting the responsibility exactly right. So let me bring it back to where we started, to the question I asked you at the beginning. I asked you to name the moment when the most powerful commander in the West put his name on a disaster that had not happened yet. Now you can. It happened in a tent in a country house on the south coast of England in the first week of June, 1944. It happened in 66 words of pencil on a single sheet of paper. And it happened because a man who could have written almost anything chose to write mine alone and underline it, and then carry it in his wallet like a loaded weapon pointed at his own reputation, just in case. He was not a perfect general. I have shown you the flaws, the favorites, the broad front, the thing he did to Devers that we will not forget. Judge all of that honestly, as he would have wanted you to. But on the one question this note was built to answer, the question of whether a commander will stand in front of his men and take the blame instead of hiding behind them, Dwight Eisenhower answered it before the guns even fired. And he answered it correctly. In a war full of men who wrote themselves into the credits, he wrote himself into the blame. That is the difference between a reputation and a character. And 80 years later, the proof of it is still sitting in a vault in Kansas, in pencil, dated wrong, signed by a man who hoped with everything in him that no one would ever have to read it. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.